very good point there. One thing to bear in mind in terms of systems thinking again is what does a home cost? And everybody say, well, I live in a $250,000 home, I live in a $500,000 home. But your home costs what you pay a month to live in it. It's the life cycle of the home. You need to look at that. And sometimes spending a few $1,000s more upfront means saving many $1,000s over the life of the home, how long you live there. Okay, next up, we've got Robert Castle-Gay, an architect with Radius Associates. He's going to talk about the desert rat behind his designs and construction of residential environment. He's been a long-time architect and instructor and builder, and he's going to talk about natural building materials and systems.
First, I have to have a sip of water out of this toxic but still recyclable bottle. The dancing red dot's not too bad. I would like to just throw in a word of appreciation for PAG for organizing this event. It's drawn people out of the woodwork, that we all live in our little categories, brought them together and got them started. So at least talking to each other. So the networking aspect of it usually is the most important part of any kind of conference event, invisible behind the scenes. I'm also pleased to be part of what has come to be a movement in green transformation, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I'm reminded, or I was in a conversation recently reminded that the first greenhouse that I did that really counts as a total house design was in 1978. And I'm startled at how many years have occurred since then. Not everything that I've done since then. Sometimes one makes a living scraping things together, but the technology has expanded, and in that time, particularly in the last 5 years, the people that we work with just as clients for normal residential projects have expanded their knowledge of green and sustainable items of all kinds. It used to be that even as recently as 10 years ago, if we would start talking to people about straw bale, they would say, oh, well, doesn't it burn? Isn't the big bad wolf going to come and blow it down? And, the questions would be fairly primitive, so you have to start answering those questions. But now, 2/3 of the time, you talk to somebody about straw, and they will say, I've been in a building made of straw. My brother-in-law built a guest house, or my friend has a bale house, or something. It's not that particular technology is not taking over the world. But my point is really that green literacy amongst the people we work with as clients, design clients, is on the increase, and it's a pleasure. It's a great thing. There is a greening going on. What I actually think is that the green building movement is part of a much larger cultural change, and these are a few features of the change that everybody pretty much who's speaking here today touches on in some form or other. They affect, I won't read this entire list, but you can see that all areas of life are really touched on by the greening of our culture. Some of it's out of necessity, some of it's out of desire. There's an emotional component in it, which is why I think it's fair to call it cultural change as well. Some people are focused more specifically on the technical aspects of it, but I think it's wise to keep in mind that we're involved in a transition time of great importance to the whole culture. That's why I liked Rich's threefold diagram. The goals of these changes are really just to understand the systems that support us and to replace corporate greed and individual gain, the advancement of single isolated individuals with a little more community and a little more connection to the systemic aspects of life. Success is redesigned in this, or redefined in this change, not really involving plundering, but survival in a very long-term sense. The 7 generations goal is not a bad one to think about. And finally, there was a festival this fall called Living La Vida Verde, the Green Life, And that was a reminder that the decisions you make involving buildings that are or are not green are really part of a much larger connection to the life that supports us. That's why I showed that image of the house being held on a person's hand. We have a responsibility for our little nests. Now, the terminology of green building is rather tangled these days, and I am not going to set out to sort it out. There are really factions and camps of all kinds, and people that feel a certain philosophical slant toward green building in one way or another. Over on the right, those are some terms that get tossed about or that people align themselves with. Generally, I would say that the people focused on natural building are more aligned toward handcraft and toward the feel of the materials that they're working with. Alternative building is people who perhaps are marginal culturally or see themselves as outside a mainstream building, but that's an area for major advancement. And I'll show you some of those forms of building in a minute. Sustainable construction has to do with long-term focus, what actually constitutes the entire system of producing a building in a way that it can last, rather than wipe out a forest and move on to the next. So the Forest Stewardship Council, for example, deals with rating wood about its sustainability. That changes the way one looks at wood framing. Earth-friendly building or ecologically responsible building or eco-building are just a reminder that the act of building exists within an ecosystem and has consequences, and that there are the subtext of those kinds of terms for building is that there are sort of laws of nature that we better pay attention to, and that's part of the environmental change. And organic architecture has a couple different meanings. Frank Lloyd Wright first started talking about it, meaning to try to connect to the planet in some very general way. But there is also a sort of school of architecture that James Havel in California exemplifies with wildly voluptuous sculptural forms. That's not exactly green building, but it is kind of a reminder of the forms of nature, certain aspects of nature, where things are more fluid than rigid. So I count that in as a camp to think about. The goals of natural building systems really are pretty clear in all of these criteria, but people stress different ones at different times. Some people have studied rather carefully the amount of transportation required to get things here, or wherever here is for you, and found that one of the aspects, or brought forward one of the aspects of sustainability that the early green building didn't think too much about, and that is how close is your material to where you're building. That has to do with the embodied energy cost. So that's one of those criteria that's kind of interesting and important, and there's a set of other ones. On site sensitivity, I really see that as a starting point of a design project, and we have spent quite a lot of time bringing out a series of ways to look at your site before you touch even a pencil. I'm very large on walking around and knowing your site in all possible ways. So on our website, there's a little handout. I don't have that with me, but it's called 43 Considerations for Site Selection. And it's a 2-page handout. You're supposed to print on the back side if you print it yourself. That has just things to look at for sites. And even though our old business name used to be Radius Associates, we had to change it to Radius Architects. So the website that you can find that handout on is radius-architects.com.